Today we're looking at Theme 2, Rights and Responsibilities. How laws protect the citizen and deal with criminals, particularly how have citizens' rights changed or developed over time. What we're going to be looking at over this session is what are the terms to remember, what is the Magna Carta and why was it set up, how has the Magna Carta developed this concept of rights in the UK, and how has the Magna Carta influenced modern society. In this part of the session, we're only going to focus on the first two. So that is, what are the key terms to remember and what is the Magna Carta and why was it set up? So the key words to remember are Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was also known as the Great Charter. It was signed by King John in 1215 and it established the rights and powers of the King and people of England. Human Rights Act is another key term to remember. This was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1998 by Parliament and came into force in 2000. It applies to the whole of the UK and brought together numerous pieces of human rights legislation and enabled UK citizens easier access to the European Court of Human Rights. It meant that all human rights cases could be trialled at any national court in the UK, and human rights needed to be upheld in every piece of legislation that was to be debated, discussed, or reviewed in the UK. Finally, the last concept that we're looking at is the rule of law. This means that no one is above the law, no matter who you are. This concept here is a British value and it upholds fairness, justice, and equality. We have just completed the first part of this session, which were the terms to remember, and now we're going to move on to looking at what the Magna Carta actually was and why it was set up. In order to understand what the Magna Carta was and why it was introduced, you firstly need to understand what feudalism is. Over here you can see the feudal pyramid. Ultimately what it was the relationship between the king, the barons, the knights and the peasants. What used to happen is that the king used to give the barons land and the king had absolute power. This meant that they made the final decision, that they would create the laws of the land and they were ultimately in control. The barons would give some of their land to the knights and the knights would give some of their land to peasants. In return, peasants would work on the knights' land. The knights would fight in the armies that belonged to the barons when needed. And finally, the barons would provide an army for the king when the king needed it. Ultimately, feudalism was the framework by which all landowning was controlled by the king. This is where the term kingdom comes from. The land was worked on by peasants and overseen by feudal barons. Everyone in the hierarchy had financial and social responsibilities to the rank above them, including the barons who reported directly to the king. King John, who was the king at the time that the Magna Carta was introduced, abused the feudal system frequently, and this angered the barons, who were regularly extorted of their lands and profits. Obviously this made them angry and fed up. In 1215 the barons rebelled and pressured the king into signing a document called the Magna Carta. This was a list of 63 clauses drawn up to limit King John's power. It was the first time royal authority officially became subject to the law instead of reigning above it. We just completed this part of this session where we looked at what the Magna Carta actually is and why it was set up. In the next video, we're going to be looking at how the Magna Carta developed the concept of rights in the UK.